Folks, we're going to go ahead and get started today. We have a great presentation. I was just chatting with Scott before we got started. And when we first booked this meeting, this was before the government shutdown. And as we've gotten deeper into the government shutdown, we've had more and more people register for this event. I know Scott is prepared for a lot of questions that you might have, and I think we're going to have a great presentation today. But before we do get started, I always like to kick these off just to let folks understand, really who Cornerstone is, why you're getting these invitations from somebody that you've maybe never heard of before, and just a couple of slides to help me do that. First of all, Cornerstone is a registered investment advisor. We're based in St. Louis, Missouri. We're actually celebrating our 20th anniversary this year. That's coming up at the end of this month. We have 133 financial advisors across 16 states. A little bit of an update to the slide. We did cross over 10 billion in assets under management a little over a month ago, so that was kind of exciting. And we have 60,000 individual clients across the country working with our financial advisors. Now, one of the reasons why maybe you don't know who Cornerstone is because your financial advisor is branding as something other than that. And you'll see a lot of the different DBAs are doing business as brands that a lot of our advisors choose to use, which is something that we fully support. We want to give them that true sense of being an independent financial advisor, and if they want to brand as something other than Cornerstone, we think that's great. That's their vision. We just try to help them support it. All of our advisors are registered with LPL Financial. They're the largest independent broker-dealer in the country. A bit of an update to this slide. That says 29,000 advisors. They're actually now up over 32,000 advisors across the country. I think probably the most important number that you see on there is in the bottom right, which is 0. And working for an independent broker-dealer, your advisor is never being pushed to sell a proprietary product. LPL does not really have any products of their own internally. So the goal really is for the financial advisor really just to do what is ultimately the right thing for the client. Now, what does this mean for you? What Cornerstone really offers to the advisor is another level of service beyond what's being provided by LPL. This webinar would be a great example of that. We do the planning. We book the speaker with Scott, who is on today through one of our great partners with Fidelity. But we will do things like that to really help our financial advisors just spend more time in front of their clients, which is really what they do best. So, the goal is really to provide them with the means of giving you better service along the way. Now, before we do get started, a bit of a housekeeping note. We are not able to allow the chat feature in our webinar today, and you're also not able to ask live questions. So if you do have questions for Scott, you need to send an email to cornerstonewm, no dots, no spaces, or anything in between that. So cornerstonewm@lpl.com. When you send that question in, it will come to me. I will ask on your behalf. If we get a lot of questions about the same thing, I'll try to compile those into maybe one more concise question so we can get through as many as possible. But feel free to send those questions throughout the presentation. And then at the end, when Scott's finished going through his comments, I'll ask those questions on your behalf. So Scott, I'm going to stop sharing, and you can start sharing your slides. But as you're doing that, I'll give just a brief introduction. So I'm really happy to have Scott Orr with me today. Scott oversees government relations at all levels and regularly speaks on Washington regulatory and political climate. He previously was a portfolio manager and managed $11 billion in Fidelity mutual funds. But then he left Fidelity for a stretch and was the CEO of 2 nonprofits along the way. And by the way, his background with investment management was municipal bonds. So, he was certainly dealing with state governments and municipalities on a very regular basis in that capacity. So that, coupled with that nonprofit background, drew him back into the political scene with Fidelity. And he has been with them for a total of 25 years. So Scott, really happy to turn things over to you and let you share some thoughts on all of the fun stuff going on in our political landscape these days.
Great. Thank you very much, Bill. Happy to be here. Happy to be able to share some thoughts with everyone on the call, and look forward to hopefully again. Please do utilize the that email account to send any questions that you have, because I want to make sure I touch on the points that are most important to you as you think about what's happening. Obviously, we're in a very interesting time when it comes to our government. We are looking at, we are still in a government shutdown. We are now in the longest government shutdown in history. If you've been paying attention, we're now at past 36 days. The previous was 35 days. So we have hit a point where I do believe that we are getting close to the end. And again, I'm not going to completely go out fully on the limb to say that, by the end of the week or early next week we'll be done, but it is getting very close. I do believe, honestly, this has always been an issue of posturing and making sure both sides, Republicans and Democrats, playing to their bases, making sure that they felt like their bases were being represented, because again, that's where sort of the center of energy comes for both the House and the Senate, and all those members of the Republicans and Democrats. And there were, I think, Democrats were wanting to get past the elections yesterday. They did not want to deflate their base by sort of giving in or caving, if that's the way it might have been seen. And so yesterday was definitely a milestone to get past, to really make sure that everyone could assess the situation. We'll talk a little bit about the elections yesterday. I won't belabor those faults. I'm always hesitant to put too much emphasis on an election that's just happened, this early out before next year. But there was a lot of discussion already about the midterms next year, and the Democrats did have a very good night, good day yesterday. They won the races they were supposed to win. They won by larger margins than they expected to. A real sign, if you look at sort of digging into the data, of a lot of pushback on President Trump, especially in these blue states. But even in places where there were independents, they seem to be moving away from Trump and toward the Democrats because they want to see change. And so this is on the minds of everyone right now in Washington, and those senators that are trying to determine what to do next, how to come to some sort of a consensus so that they can reopen the government. And I think part of that is looking at what the spending bills look like for the next year or so. They're trying to put together some bills that will really not just go out a month or 2 months, but go out maybe a full year. On the Senate side, again, the challenge is going to be, once the Senate passes those, they got to come back to the House and pass the House as well. And if that happens, it's probably going to have to be some kind of a bipartisan consensus, because right now, a lot of the hardcore Republicans would not agree to that. And I always want to say this at the beginning of these conversations. I work with both sides of the aisle. We at Fidelity have great relationships with both Republicans and Democrats. And as I always tell folks in these, I am not Fox. I'm not MSNBC. I'm not here to tell you how to vote, who's better, who's doing the best, how you should vote. But just wanting to share with you some of the information we get directly from these members of Congress in our conversations that we have. So that is the goal. But just to level set, looking at this slide here, we do have a Republican majority in the Senate, Republican majority in the House, both relatively tight. Obviously, the reason that we are in a government shutdown right now is that Republicans only have 53 Senate votes. If they had 60, this would all be done. This never would have happened in the first place. But that filibuster is there for a purpose. The filibuster is in place, and that filibuster is what the Democrats are using right now to keep any kind of a reopening from happening. However, again, there are both sides of these equations, and this is the one opportunity Democrats have to flex some muscle because of that filibuster, and that's why you're seeing the current impasse that you have currently. They were not happy about the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. We'll be talking about that, but not a single Democrat voted for that bill, either the House or the Senate. And that just creates a lot of animosity. That whole idea of using this, what they call reconciliation, to pass a bill without the filibuster, which again is a pretty arcane set of rules that the Senate passes, but the Senate has in place. And honestly, before the Affordable Care Act, it had not been used very much, in Congress. But since that time, and since both parties have realized they can have success using this reconciliation process, which means it's sort of a budget. You're literally reconciling the House and the Senate budgets to bring that together. The fact that they can use that tool has become an effective way to advance legislation, but every time it is a polarizing event every time you pass one of those, because the party that is not in power feels like they've been run over. So this is a little bit of this government shutdown, all the things that are happening right now is a bit of a reaction to the One Big Beautiful Bill Act passing and Democrats feeling that will shove down their throat. And we'll talk a little bit more about that and some of those things as well. But again, 53-47 in the Senate, 219 to 214 in the House. That 214 is a little bit of an asterisk because that includes Representative Grijalva in Arizona, who was just elected about, I guess it's almost been a month now, in a special election to replace her father who had passed away in Arizona, but she has not yet been seated. So it's officially 213, but again, the House has not been in session, so that really hasn't come into play. But now that's 214. Just yesterday, there was a special election in Texas to fill a spot, and a Democrat will fill that spot eventually. But again, that is also, there's a runoff in that election, so that spot will not be filled. And there is also a special election coming up in December in Tennessee to replace the one opening on the Republican side, meaning there's a red district that's sitting out there in Tennessee. So by the end of the year, probably by the end of the year, we'll have a 220 to 215 House. But again, still a very small minority for Speaker Mike Johnson to work with to try to bring things forward, and it is a challenge. But again, the mere fact, just sort of looking how fragile these majorities are, and kind of what the different parties are, what the dynamics are. The fact that 3 Democrats have passed away since January in the House of Representatives. The only reason the One Big Beautiful Bill Act passed is that there were 3 fewer Democrats in the House at one time when those bills were being discussed and passed, because they really only passed by 1 vote, even with the margin that the Republicans had. So it is something that's always on the minds of the House members and the Senate, but especially in the House, that basically Speaker Mike Johnson can only lose 3 votes at any given time among his caucus if he wants to be able to continue to pass bills. So it is a challenge. It's always a challenge. It's always there. And of course, the parties are very much at each other. The Democrats are staying united in opposition. The Republicans are not always united, again, especially based on the topic. And there's a few renegades, especially within the party on the Republican side, that sometimes keep things from moving forward. But for the most part, they are working together, and they're very much focused against each other. And people always ask me, why are we such a polarized country, or why is Congress so polarized? And the answer is that we are actually a fairly polarized country right now. There's periods of time in the past when there was kind of a more moderate middle that seem to always want to sort of promote bipartisanship, but just the nature of where we are currently, and what people see either in their social media or how they get their news or whatever it is that drives them. If you look at this chart, I think it's pretty remarkable that only about 18% of Democrats and only about 12% of Republicans want their representative to be more moderate. They want their mark. So if you look at the other end of the spectrum, 50% of Democrats and 40% of Republicans want their representative to be more extreme than they are. So the fact is that when these politicians go home, and again, the House members have been home now for over a month, when they go home, they're being told, if they're Democrats, stick with it, don't give in. We want you to push back against Trump and the Republicans. The Republicans are saying, be more belligerent, make sure that you are using your majority to get done what's happening. And so when you are back home, and it's not a surprise that elected officials like to get reelected, when that process is going on at all times, and House members are always campaigning, because again, every 2 years they're having to be reelected. Every 2 years they're having to win a party primary. They really want to make sure that all this is happening in their favor. And for that reason, they're not really incentivized to be able to go out and reach across the aisle and get things done. And so that's sort of the unfortunate result of where we are currently with our current state of play. And the other big piece of this too is there are so few swing districts left. And I won't belabor this point, but if we had a lot more time to talk about it, I'm happy to talk about this more. But back in 1998, if you look at this chart, a swing district means it's less than Republican +5 or Democrat +5. So if it's in that margin of +5, -5, which means that it can really swing fairly easily from election to election, depending on the environment, depending on the candidates, et cetera, et cetera. Back in 1998, there were 164 out of the 435 seats in the House. There were 164 districts that were swing districts. Now we're down to 23. And after a lot of this redistricting that's happening currently in the different states, what's happening in California as of yesterday, what happened in Texas a few weeks ago, I'm sure we're probably, if you do the measurement, it will probably be down to 18 or so swing districts, which means it makes it very, number one, it makes it very difficult to have big wave elections where you have a huge move of 40 seats being flipped from Republican to Democrat or vice versa. But the other big point of it is if you're in a district that is Republican plus 20 or Democrat plus 20, you have no interest in moderate your stances, and you have no interest in doing whatever, basically doing whatever your base wants you to do. So on that prior slide, if your base is saying 50% are saying be more extreme, don't be more moderate, you're going to be more extreme and you're not going to be more moderate, because if you're not more extreme, you're going to get a primary challenge. And if you lose your primary, that person is going to win the general election because that district is so deeply blue or so deeply red. So that is the state of play where we are right now. This is part of the core, I think, of why there's so much dysfunction in Congress, is because so many states have gotten so adept at redistricting and getting rid of these districts that can swing either direction, and basically cementing the fact they're going to be firmly Democratic or firmly Republican through that process. And you also think about what's happening in President Trump, because he is a big specter over all of this, obviously, a very boisterous president, a president that, some call a bull in a china shop these days, that's going in and just making such dramatic change all the time, using his executive orders to on a historically strong basis to try to get as many things done as possible through the process. And I think some people believe, he's running roughshod over the Constitution. And in fact, some of the things that he has proposed probably are not going to be constitutional. But the courts have to go through that process to determine what it is, how successful his executive orders are going to be. I think this chart shows, honestly, that the process is working. It may not be working as quickly as some want it to, or some may be skeptical that, exactly how the courts are fitting into this. But if you look at this chart, more than half the time, President Trump is losing out when it comes to the courts and those things that he's proposed in his executive orders. Some people say, he has been sued more often than any president in history, and that is true. Also, though, he has issued more executive orders than any president in history relative to this point of his term. The only president that was equal to him in executive orders was FDR back in the day. And so President Trump, has used the executive orders to try to get things done. The courts have pushed back in many cases, but he's also been successful. So the reds are where the courts have said absolutely not. The greens have said, what you proposed is going to be constitutional and it's going to fly. And the yellows are the ones that are still to be determined. So there is a lot here. Again, I'm not going to get too deep into this chart, other than to say I think it's very interesting to see the fact that there's areas where President Trump has lost many more than he's won, especially when it comes to some of the federal funding, the immigration issues, things like that. Where he has been successful is on the tariff front, and that is a big one. But again, the big news there is that the Supreme Court will be hearing a case on tariffs later this year, and that will be a big determinant of what's happening with his tariff strategy, which, again, I'll just touch on briefly as well. I know tariffs are a concern to folks. I wish I had some magic wand to tell you exactly how tariffs are supposed to be working and what's going to be happening in the future. But the mere fact is President Trump believes that tariffs are his main tool to be able to get negotiation power over other countries, to be able to change where he believes the United States is relative to other countries. And he has a point to a degree, and this chart actually has been shared with me by more than one member of Congress, or a chart like this, is that this is something that was shared with President Trump even before he was president, a chart of this nature, which shows that if you look at the G20 nations, the United States does have the fewest barriers to trade. Going into President Trump's presidency, almost every other country has more tariffs. It has more non-tariff barriers, and the United States is at the bottom of that list. And as you know from President Trump, he does not like to see the United States at the bottom of any list. And so he has seen this, taken it to heart, and his goal is to not only increase the trade barriers that the United States has in place, but also to hopefully bring down some of the others from other countries as well. So this is what drives this strategy, but it's just not anything that it can be looked at as an orderly strategy. There is not any point, as we know, we see huge increases, then they come back. They're part of a negotiation strategy for a trade deal, and they're going to be controversial, and they're going to be erratic as long as he's able to do that. If the Supreme Court finally puts a kibosh on it and says that Congress is going to have to be involved, that's going to completely change that strategy. But until that point, President Trump's going to continue to use these as a negotiation point through the process. Um, Fortunately, I think one good thing is obviously the markets were very unhappy about these early on. Back on Liberation Day or whatever he was calling it, whenever he announced the first tariffs, and the market tanked so extremely. That now, as these tariffs come out, there's hardly ever a blip at all in it, because I can't believe the view is that it's probably temporary, it's probably not permanent. It's a means to an end, and the markets have been beaten into submission, I think, by President Trump when it comes to how to react to these things. So from a good standpoint, there's been a little more stability in the markets, but you also worry a little bit about complacency as well, and that there's so much little attached to this, that if something dramatic does happen with tariffs, that could be a problem. And one issue that we really have, and we'll talk about deficits here in a little bit, is that we have now, as a country, collected almost $1 trillion in tariffs over time, over the period of time that is involved. And if this is reversed and somehow the Supreme Court says these were unlawful and those monies have to be returned, that is going to be a big blow to what's happening with the with the deficits and what happens going forward. So there is a lot to go through in this process. This is a lot of what President Trump and even Congress is counting on going forward. And so it's going to be interesting to see how this works together as well. Again, I think this chart is interesting to keep up with. This is looking at, if you put $1,000, or if you put, looking at the S&P 500 index to the day that Trump was elected both times and when President Biden was elected. And if you look at it, I think, as you can see, there was a big dip to begin with because, again, of the tariffs and some of the other things that were sort of a self-inflicted wound that President Trump did to himself in his second, which is that blue line near the bottom. But now it's up to about where he has been, where he was in his first term. And again, if you look at this, both Trump versus Biden, Trump first term versus Biden, thing I think is always remarkable is if you look at it, when you get to the end of their first terms, they're almost the identical place. The markets performed almost identically in the long run between President Trump in his first term and President Biden his term. So again, back to, as we talk about elections going forward, it's not always who the president is that determines how the markets do. There's a lot of other factors to think about as well. So another issue here, people ask me all the time is, when is Congress going to wake up and abandon the president because he's so unpopular? He has been kind of hanging in for a while at kind of this 45 approval rating, which historically actually is not all that low for a president in his second term. But it's interesting. There's been a big change just in the last few weeks in his job approval rating, and he has lost a couple of points fairly suddenly, and his disapproval rating has increased fairly quickly. And right now, he's at a point where he has the largest gap between his approval and disapproval ratings. And so you might look at that. That's probably a big driver of the success that the Democrats had in Virginia and New Jersey, especially where there were statewide races. Not only did those governors remain Democratic, on the Virginia side, it flipped from Republican to Democrat. In New Jersey, they remained a Democrat, being the governor, but they lost House seats as well at the state level. And so you're going to see that there's a big pushback right now against President Trump. And a lot of it is related to a chart like this, because so many people, especially in bluer states, are pushing back against the president and not approving of how he is handling his presidency. The thing is, though, when it comes to Congress and Republicans in the House, as I said, Republicans like to get reelected. The vast majority of them, if you remember that chart, are in districts that are Republican plus 10, 15, 20 or more. they're not about to abandon the president, because when they go home, they're still hearing that we kind of like President Trump and we appreciate President Trump, et cetera, et cetera. So red districts are not pushing back or not losing. They're still 80% approval rating for President Trump. It really is only the blue districts. And again, those House members that represent Republican districts are not going to back down from that. There are some in those purple districts that are going to probably be having heartburn over yesterday and are going to be thinking much hard about what that looks like for next year's midterms. And we'll talk about that in a little bit as well. But this is a chart that shows kind of in general, the population has turned against President Trump even more just in the last few weeks. It'll be interesting to see if he's able to recover some of that and get back to kind of where his steady state has been for much of his presidency. One thing that did happen that was good from our standpoint at Fidelity, especially, we are very involved in the digital asset markets, just because we believe it's something that's important to be able to offer to customers if that's something they'd like to be able to do. Is there was a time when Congress did come together back in July and they passed the Genius Act, which allows for a much better environment for stablecoin issuance that you'll be hearing much more about. You may be already aware of stablecoin and how stablecoin works, but this has been a big push within Congress to be able to come forward and have a more clear system of how they're going to be regulated, making sure there's consumer protections, making sure that you have a way to get rid of bad actors. They don't want more, Sam Bankman-Fried. They want to try to keep all of the the industry a little bit more regulated and a bit more legitimate when it comes down to it. And that bill did pass the House, it passed the Senate, and the president signed it back in July. Again, we believe from a Fidelity standpoint that this is something that's important. We want to see appropriate regulation in this area, because if people do want to invest in Bitcoin and Ethereum and use stablecoin, they should be able to do it with the confidence that there are regulators that are keeping an eye on how that works. The Clarity Act also passed the House. It has not passed the Senate yet. The Senate is looking at some different things that will probably delay this somewhat. And of course, in the current state of the Senate, they're not even thinking about this right now. But again, that even looks further at Bitcoin, Ethereum, a lot of the actual blockchain, the cryptocurrencies, and making sure that the SEC and the CFTC are very firmly in place for the oversight that they have for those coins. So I won't go into deep depth here, but I do believe it's an area where Congress did come together, realize from a bipartisan standpoint that it's important for the United States to take a leadership role for this globally, and has passed these bills that should create a little more framework of legitimacy around cryptocurrencies as it moves forward. Then, of course, you have the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, and I'm not going to go through every aspect of this, but it was a fairly significant, successful bill to be passed by the Republicans. The previous law that the Republicans passed under President Trump's first term was a Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. The way it was set up originally is they had to make a lot of the aspects, especially as it related to individuals, they had to make that temporary. And temporary meaning sort of a 9 or 10 year period of time, which is why there were so many of those tax cuts that were expiring on December 31st of this year. So the fact that not only were they able to extend those tax cuts, but also make most of them permanent, that was a really key accomplishment from that standpoint, is they were able to make those permanent. So now it's going to take an act of Congress. It's going to take a bill that is passed the House, the Senate, signed by the president, to change some of these things that previously were going to expire on their own. So now you have the top tax rate, the brackets are pretty much set in place. The much larger standard deduction that went into place is now permanent, and it will increase with inflation over time. The child tax credit was increased and made permanent. The SALT deduction, many people care a lot about that. The fact that you can only deduct $10,000 of your state and local taxes under the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, that actually was increased to $40,000, but that is temporary. So that increased cap of $40,000 is only going to go through the 2029. And even that $40,000 is not absolute, because if you make, I believe, over roughly $400,000 a year, that actually starts to tick back, and at some point it's back down to $10,000 again. So there is somewhat of a limitation on higher earners, but it did increase that cap, and that was an important thing to a number of Republicans that sit in New York and New Jersey and California that are very nervous that they would not be reelected if they had not increased that state and local tax deduction cap, because that is one of the biggest gripes of some of the blue states. And there are Republican House members in most of those states. The estate and gift tax exemption was made permanent again at 15 million and will continue to be indexed for inflation. So all these things were in place. The only thing that really is not a permanent here, other than the salt tax, the salt deduction increase, is the things that President Trump had promised on the campaign trail. They really were not in the minds of Congress, as they were thinking ahead toward, if Trump wins, if we have the control of the House and the Senate, we're going to want this reconciliation bill to be able to extend the tax cuts. They weren't really thinking about no tax on tips or no tax on overtime or no tax on Social Security, and those were things that President Trump campaigned on, and so he was insistent that they be in this bill. So, kind of interestingly enough, they only made them last through President Trump's term. So by 2028, the no tax on tips or no tax on overtime will be repealed, and it'll go back to being taxed again. It'll be very interesting to see how that actually works out, because as we can see right now from the Affordable Care Act subsidies that we are arguing over based on the current government shutdown, it is very difficult to pull something back once it's been given to the American public. And so I think if you really see some, a significant number of individuals that are taking advantage and appreciating the fact that they're not paying tax on their tips, if they're servers or in some group that is, tipping is a customary part of their compensation, then they're going to not like it, in 2028, whoever the next president is, if that's not extended further. So just something to watch. Again, just a lesson to learn, and something that we've known for some time, which is once something is put out there, once people depend on something, it's very difficult to take that back through that process. So from our standpoint at Fidelity, just kind of so you understand where we come from, again, my job is to manage all of our government relations, and I manage all of our government relations west of New York, basically. So we have different folks around the country that work on our team, that work directly at the state level, but also as first line of relationship with our members of Congress. We're not out there telling Congress where to set the top tax rate. It should be 37 or 36 or 39. We're not out there telling them, exactly where the bracket should land. But we are trying to make sure that if this bill is going to pass, that there were elements of it that not only were included, that were positive, but that would help, make some other things permanent as well. So the one thing that we were very pleased about is they added some things with health savings accounts. So their eligibility for some of the things in the ACA marketplace are there. Some of the telehealth arrangements, things like that, are now permanent in the health savings accounts, which is now in that bill. Also, student loan repayments, things like that, where employers are helping their employees pay back their student loans. A lot of those were made permanent as well. So those were the things that we were pushing for to include in the bill. And again, we're successful in getting those done. The other things that we were pushing at from our standpoint and from the industry standpoint is wanting to make sure that they weren't going to harm the markets in order to pay for this One Big Beautiful Bill Act. And so, believe it or not, there was some pretty significant traction at different times in Congress. For example, to eliminate municipal bond tax exemption. Bill mentioned I was a municipal bond portfolio manager, and I know how disruptive it will be if suddenly these municipal bonds that you bought, assuming they're tax-free and that you're paying tax-free interest, suddenly become taxable. That would obviously have been a huge problem. Even if that was on a going forward basis, that would be a problem. Basically, some members were wanting to remove the ability to deduct your, from your income, your investments in your 401k or an IRA, and make everything like a Roth IRA, where you don't get an immediate tax benefit, but you get a better result at the end of the period. But those are all things that we felt were going to be very negative, that we pushed hard back on to try to make sure that didn't continue to happen. So I'm going to keep moving just so that we can keep things covered. And again, if you have questions, please make sure that you're emailing those to Bill, and we can touch on other things as well. The other thing I'm just going to mention is Trump accounts. And like it or not, these are in place. These are things that are in place. And there is $1,000 of free money for every child that is born between 2024 and 2029. So if you have someone in your orbit, excuse me, that is in that safe, there is going to be $1,000 that is going to be put into an account or being available to put into an account if those accounts are set up. And again, you as parents or grandparents or relatives or employers could also put money into those accounts as well, get some tax benefit from doing that, and help start again a savings account for these young people as they grow. And so it's going to be interesting to see. These are not just like IRAs. They're not really like 529 accounts. They are kind of their own kind of mix of all those sorts of things. But basically, distributions after 18 would be allowed. They can't make distributions up until the time they're 18. From our standpoint, Fidelity, anything that helps people save is a good thing. We're actually trying to figure out how to make sure these are offered as well. And I'm sure LPL and Cornerstone and others are going to be trying to look at that as well. Some of the challenges, what makes it different than a real, normal IRA, which has a broad array of places where you can invest the money. This money has to be put in an index fund that is based on a domestic index. And even that is being determined. All of this is not going to be allowed to start until next July. So July of next year of 2026 is the first time these actually can be set up and begin to be used by the public. But it's going to have to be in an index fund. The basis points, the basis point fees cannot be more than 10 basis points, which is a challenge, even in this kind of low fee atmosphere that we're in currently. And we're even trying to determine if a typical S&P 500 fund meets exactly the parameters of the law as well. So there's a lot to still be determined and to be figured out. But you need to be thinking, again, if you have someone in your within your influence and that you care about that is going to be born or has been born or is going to be born in this time frame, you should be thinking about taking advantage of this, because even if you only put $1,000 aside and start growing that, that's something that's free money that I think a lot of people will take advantage of. So something just to pay attention to starting next July. One thing I'm just going to touch on, and I'm not going to delve too deeply into this unless there's questions about it. The big question right now is how this is going to be paid for and what's going to happen to deficits in the federal debt based on the passage of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. So this dotted line here at the top, the dotted line with the black line, is what the Congressional Budget Office believes is going to be happening to the debt levels based on the passage of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. So they're basically saying we expect, as a nonpartisan group that is, sort of charged by Congress to estimate how expensive these bills are going to be or what these bills will do to debt deficits and debt. They are foreseeing that we're already at 100% debt to GDP, which is the highest that we've been in the history of the United States, except for a brief period of time back during World War II. But you're looking at a period where the Congressional Budget Office believes you're going to see dramatic or fairly steady increases in deficits and debt levels because of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act and the fact that potentially less revenue is coming in because of the extension of all the tax cuts. Then you have the red line below, which is the Council of Economic Advisors, which is the White House version of scoring debt and scoring, these bills. They look at this, and because of what they believe is going to be economic growth in other areas and some of the tariffs, things like that, they're putting in projections that show they actually see a decrease in deficits and debt levels going forward. So obviously a big switch, a big gap between what the Congressional Budget Office believes and what the White House believes. Congress really the Republicans in Congress really are looking at this red line and the Council of Economic Advisors estimates for their initiative. The reason they end up were being able to vote for this bill because they are, hoping and believing that there will be an opportunity for deficits to come down. But again, will be interesting to watch here in the coming years who was right when it comes down to this. If it was not such a serious thing, it might be something just to kind of put bets on. But the point is that there is huge disagreement between Congressional Budget Office, Council of Economic Advisors, and depending on who's right, will have a big influence on what happens with our federal debt. One thing that people don't probably realize is buried in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act was a $5 trillion increase in the debt limit. So there really is not a debt ceiling that is impinging on Congress anytime soon. And so that's sort of taken that argument out of the picture. But obviously, the fact that it's in there has shown that there is an expectation that debt and deficits could increase. Again, this is just kind of a quick, we did hit right at $1.8 trillion in deficits this year, which is a pretty remarkable number on its own. Historically, that's a big number, absent the two bad COVID years. We were in a period of time where our deficits continue to grow. And again, if the Congressional Budget Office is correct, they're going to continue to grow. And a big piece of it is the interest that's paid on that federal debt. The interest is consuming more and more of our budget as a country. And in fact, we spend more on that interest than we do on defense, more than we do on Medicare, more than we do on Medicaid. So it is a huge number, continues to grow, and continue to be a problem. Against this chart I was telling you about, that in World War II is the last time we were at 100% debt to GDP. We're there now, and again, we may see that continue to go forward. So again, we can talk further about that. Don't have time in this call to really talk about what that actually means, but it is something that's continued to be a problem. I'm going to skip over a lot of this because again, I think from your standpoint, I want to make sure I'm concentrating on the things that you care deeply about. Number one, when is Congress going to get the government funded? I do believe that there's going to be enough senators that come together with some sort of a compromise expected, maybe wanting to pass a bill that would actually push out some appropriations for the federal government out into next year to kind of avoid having another one of these short-term continuing resolutions. That should happen relatively soon. There's things that Congress has to do, in addition to just obviously paying government employees, making sure the airports are working, making sure TSA and the airline controllers are all being paid. But they've got to pass the National Defense Authorization Act before the end of the year. They have to pass the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act. These are all things that are very important to the federal government, to the American people. Congress has to be in place to be able to get those done. And again, typically they're not very controversial, but they have been in recent years because Congress tends to attach things to these must-pass bills. So it'll be interesting to see what happens for that going forward. People, I've touched on this really briefly. People are worried about the independence of the Fed. From my perspective, everyone I talk to, I do believe the Fed is continuing to operate in an independent fashion. They are looking at the numbers they need to look at. They are looking at employment. They're looking at inflation. Even though President Trump has tried to come in and sort of, put some pressure on them. The fact Jerome Powell, yes, Chair Powell may not be there when his term ends next year, but other members have some longer terms here and will probably be in place. And as Trump adds, he may add people to the Fed and to governors that he believes will be more aligned with his thinking. But there still is a belief that there is a lot of independence within the Fed that is going to push back when the president puts too much pressure on them. The SEC as well is a place where it's a little bit more cooperative SEC than we've had and seen in previous administrations, but they're still exerting their power. Again, I'm going to go pretty quickly through this. I think just the thing to remember as I kind of close out is thinking through next year. So much of this is already talking about what does this mean for the midterms next year. I will tell you, President Trump, as you can imagine, is scared to death of a Democratic House when it comes to his ability to continue to manage what he wants to manage and hopefully move forward some legislation. The fact that if the Democrats take back the House, and as you know, it only takes, as we mentioned, it only takes three seats to flip from red to blue for the Democrats to be back in control and to have Speaker Jeffries as opposed to Majority Leader Jeffries. You're going to basically see that a minority. I'm sorry. The fact that you've got the House is in play for Democrats, and I think yesterday was a great example that if the current environment continues, there is an opportunity for Democrats to pick up a significant number of seats. Not the huge number, not a huge blue wave, but even if they only pick up 5 to 10 seats, they're going to have the majority. There will be hearings, there will be investigations, there'll be all sorts of things that they're able to do with the majority in the House that will make the last 2 years of President Trump's life miserable. And again, you can see, we're in a period of time where this is what happens in our current environment. These deep red and deep blues are when one party had full control. And as you can see, there are periods back, in the early 1900s and before that, there were long periods where one party had full control. Now, as you see, as you get farther and farther over to the right, every 2 years, someone either gains it or loses it. Trump had full control for 2 years, and he lost it. Biden had full control for 2 years, and he lost it. Trump has had full control, and he will have it for another year or so. But if he loses it, you're going to be back to even more gridlock. And again, another impeachment hearing, all the sorts of things that you would expect to happen that will make it very difficult for him to be able to work through this. Again, I'm not going to go through all these houses, but it is truly a toss up right now. And again, if there's questions about things, we can talk about these specifically, but it's a toss up period. You're looking at a situation where if things continue as they're continuing, and again, if yesterday is any sort of an idea, there is enough pushback on Trump that you're probably going to see some of these red seats flip to blue, those that are in these kind of, as I mentioned, sort of the toss up category. And if that happens, even just in 3 or 4 situations, you're going to see a democratically held House, which is looking more and more likely. I wouldn't say likely, but Democrats are on a path that they like to see through this process. A lot can happen in the next year, so I'm not about to make any kind of prediction, but there is still a 50-50 chance that Democrats take it back, and perhaps even better if historic holds. The Senate's another area. It's going to be very difficult for Democrats to take back the Senate. Just because it is a situation where even though there's more Senate seats on the Republican side that are up for grabs, these are pretty red states, if you notice around the country. And Democrats have to get 4 of these because, again, even 50-50 doesn't help because you have Vice President Vance to come in and break the tie. So the fact that they've got to not only pick off, for example, Susan Collins in Maine and perhaps pick up the North Carolina seat that's open, those are both doable. But then you have to look at Ohio as probably the next best chance. And then after that, it's Iowa, and then it's Texas. They're getting more and more difficult to be able to pick off 4 of those to be able to take back. And they also have to make sure they continue to win Georgia, and they've got to reelect Senator Ossoff on the Democratic side. They have to find someone in Michigan that could win that seat. Same thing in New Hampshire. And now Governor Sununu is talking about running in New Hampshire. That could be a flip back the other way because he's a very popular governor. So again, a lot to happen. I don't expect to see, most people don't put much hope for Democrats to take back the Senate, but a good chance to take back the House. I'm going to stop there and take some questions. Sorry, I've gone on a little bit long.
No, Scott, that was actually great. And you touched on, I think, a lot of the areas that were on folks' minds for sure. Just a reminder to ask questions. You do it through email, and that's Cornerstone WM. Again, no dots, no spaces, but Cornerstone WM at LPL.com. Those questions will come to me, and then I'll ask on your behalf to Scott. And Scott, we actually did already have a few come in. So I'll just kind of go ahead and ask those while maybe some others do come in. And I kind of have to give that same caveat that you gave, or that same disclaimer, that same disclaimer that you gave at the beginning of yours, which is you're just here to kind of report what you're hearing from both sides. So don't take any questions that I might ask as any kind of political bias. We obviously like to keep these conversations just based on the facts. So the question came in, and it talked about, you talked about how divided both parties are, where both parties are really kind of being run by the fringes of each side. The question was, really, if you're a student of history, how does that end, or how does that resolve itself? How does it get to maybe a more workable situation where you maybe are appealing to the folks who are somewhere in the middle?
It's a great question, and I think it's something a lot of us long for when it comes down to it. In my role, where we're working with both sides of the aisle and trying to get bills passed on a bipartisan basis, there are things that we're trying to get done within the industry and at Fidelity that we believe are good for the markets and good for customers, but they are going to take bipartisan solutions. It's not something that one party can jam through. We're in a change. I mean, it's difficult. There's so many factors that lead into it. I mentioned the gerrymandering, and the fact that you've got so few swing districts is a problem, again, because the redder or bluer your district gets, the more likely you're going to have an extreme representative. It's just a fact of life. Number 2 is social media and how people get their news. And the fact is that, Pew Research did a study recently that showed that 78% of people only get news from sources that reinforce their point of view. So if you're a Republican, you're watching Fox and nobody else, and you don't trust anyone else. And if you're a Democrat, you're watching MSNBC or CNN or whoever, and you don't, trust what Fox says. You don't want to hear what Fox says. And your point of view is constantly reinforced. And I see it all the time among my friends. I'm always having to try to, kind of waltz through, even in personal relationships, how people believe about these things. But that is part of the problem, is how social media pushes us farther and farther in our own corners. And the other fact is, we don't vote in the primaries. That is a big problem, honestly. It's because, as I said, if these districts are so extreme, then you need to make sure that who you're voting for in the primary is the candidate that you want to bring forward. And until you start seeing more moderate candidates in those primaries, we're not going to see a change there. I just think it's going to take a little bit of a, just further, the pendulum always swings, but we're still swinging toward polarization. We're not swinging back toward any kind of moderation anytime soon. It could be, again, the personality in the White House has something to do with it as well. So I won't blame President Trump, but he definitely is not one that's tamping down on any kind of polarization through the process as well. Although, again, if you look at it, the likely candidates for president going forward are not always in the moderate as well, thinking about who may be looking at 2028. So I wish I could be more hopeful, but I just believe that it's a confluence of a lot of events that continue to push us into corners and not together.
Sure, sure. You talked about debt and deficits, and I think that's always a topic that folks are
Yes.
thinking about. And again, kind of giving that disclaimer. If you look at that long-term chart of debt and deficits, no party is necessarily the better of the two. Both of
Yeah.
them really have done this over time. But the question was really kind of being tied to not only is there any positive outlook on that, or any real momentum, or any real discussion about doing something about it. But then there was a follow-up in there about Doge. Obviously, we
Yeah.
heard a lot about Doge
Right.
when Elon Musk was there. Is that still a thing?
Yeah. And again, I pull this chart up just because I think I do try to pull this up when people ask the question. It truly is Republicans always say it's because we spend too much. Democrats spend too much. That's why we've got debt and deficits. Democrats say Republicans are cutting tax for the wealthy, and wealthy are not paying their fair share. When it comes down to it, 80%, and this is a little bit dated chart, but it's still a true statement, that close to 80% of our debt and our current deficits are based on bills that were passed by both parties jointly. And so the fact is, it's a little bit Republican, a little bit Democrat, a lot of it Congress in general. Because if you think about it, no one wants to say we're going to raise your taxes. No one wants to say we're going to cut programs that you like. The mere fact, again, that these subsidies that were put in place for the Affordable Care Act that are expiring at the end of this year, that are the heart of the government shutdown right now, from the Republican standpoint, Democrats passed that through a reconciliation bill. If they wanted to be permanent, they should have been permanent. They should have made them permanent if they wanted to be permanent. They passed them during COVID, and they put them in place. They should be expiring because we're not in COVID anymore. Democratic side of that story is, we put those in place to help more people get insurance. They're now relying on that. It's a very good point that over 20 million Americans are taking advantage of the Affordable Care Act because of those subsidies. If they go away suddenly, as you've probably seen the charts, their numbers go way up. I bring all that up to say, no one wants to go back to those folks and say, we're going to cut that because our deficit's too high. It's just, once something is out there, once someone's relying on it, it's very difficult for that program to be cut, and it's almost an impossibility. Some people believe the only way to do it is to grow out of it, or to inflate ourselves out of it, and go. Those are all very scary thoughts about how some of that might happen. But until someone invokes some fiscal discipline, it's going to be very, very challenging, and that means looking at ways to increase revenues by probably increasing taxes in certain places, and also cutting back on expenses. This chart, if you look at the bottom, the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget, crfb.org, is a great place. And I recommend to anyone on this call. It's one of my favorite sites to go to because it's bipartisan, and they do have real solutions about how to bring down the debt and the deficits. And they don't really care if they're not politically popular. They basically just say, here's what needs to happen. And so that is kind of what they push to try to say, if we're going to get out of this hole, we're going to have areas where we both sides give, and that's kind of what will get us there.
I'm going to give you one more that just came in, and
Sure.
it's great that you have the portfolio manager background, because this one's going to ask you to put on your market prognosticator or economic forecasting hat. So the question was really about, you're hearing a lot from some economists as well as, some market seers, if you will, who are saying, we're in good shape as far as recessions go for now, but we really see a challenge late in 2026 and then maybe even into 2027. The question was really around, is this due to market fundamentals, which of course it's kind of hard to see out that far in terms of what the market fundamentals are, or maybe is there some sort of policy shift, or just is it the business cycle? What's maybe underlying some of those concerns?
Yeah, I mean that's a good complicated question when you think about all the different factors that could go into that. And I always I defer on these questions by saying, we got Uri and Timmer and others that spend all day long thinking about these things. But just from my observation, a lot of it is the policy environment, and I do think the policy environment is a bit more business friendly. It's probably what's keeping some of the hope that many people believe at this point in the cycle we should be headed toward a recession. And so part of it is there is less regulatory policy involved, and the SEC and others are going to be, and really most of the federal agencies are going to have less regulatory um, pulling down on the economy, and so that's generally good for business. But again, interest rates are still high, and they're going to have to stay high. Part of that is because of the amount of debt that we have outstanding, and kind of what continues to impinge and sort of crowd out capital in the market there. Um, and again, the tariffs are just a huge question mark. We don't know at this point how these tariffs that have been in place, they really have not flowed through the economy yet. We don't know completely what's going to happen there. And again, we don't even know what President Trump's plans are for tariffs, as far as he's going to increase them or decrease them. There is some belief that some of these improved trade agreements will help as well and help buoy things. I do know that President Trump's going to be laser focused on wanting a good economy through next year's midterms, because again, that will help him. And again, from that standpoint, that's some cynical people believe that all he really wants is to get the economy good through the next midterm so he can keep a Republican House and be able to move forward. I'm a little more broader than that, but I think all of the things are going to go into the federal government's going to want to see a positive economy at least for the next year, and after that, I think that's when some of these things may come home to roost. So that's kind of a rambling answer, but I do know the good news is the Fed does have a lot of space to work with. They still have rates that they can bring down if they truly believe we're headed to a recession. And as long as inflation doesn't, go off the charts, so far it doesn't seem to be. I think we have the ability for the Fed to be able to monitor and keep the economy at least at a steady state for some time.
Well, Scott, I really appreciate you being with us today. We're right at the 1 hour mark, and we always try to wrap things up at that point. But information was fantastic. Really appreciate you spending the time with us. And for those who are still with us at this point, this was recorded. So if you want to listen to this again, or maybe you have a friend that you want to forward it to, if you think it might be good for them to hear, check with your financial advisor. It usually takes us about a week, maybe a week and a half to send this through compliance, get it approved, but your financial advisor will have this link coming out to them for the replay of the webinar that can be shared at that point. But again, Scott, thank you very much, and really appreciate everybody's time today.
Thank you.
Thank you.